Hi, I'm Brian Suskind, he, him. I'm one of the longtime Kobold designers. I did about 30,000 words or 15,000 words for this book, which was an interesting experience. But you've probably seen my work on various Kobold stuff, and I'm usually loitering around the Discord to answer questions for people. So great to be here.
Hi, I'm Mike Wellham. I've been around doing work for Kobold Press since 2011. For Dungeons and Ruins, I had 16,000 words. I got to do some monsters, and I got to sneak a couple other monsters in later on. So that's what I got to do.
And I am your host, Kendrick or Kendo, whichever you prefer. I use they, he pronouns. And today I will be speaking for Jeff Lee because Jeff's mic isn't working. He says, "Hi, I'm Jeff Lee, a decade plus freelancer, and I've done several projects for Kobold Press for this book. I did a chapter on traps, curses, and hazards." So for our first question, we have, how will the content in this book differ and complement the material from the Game Master's Guide, which I know some of you worked on?
Okay, yeah, I mean, for this, so for Dungeons and Ruins, I had two main assignments. I was working on uh usually I get player forward stuff. I've done a lot of subclasses and I've done a lot of, you know, spell systems and stuff. This time I got uh hex crawls, like how to do hex crawls and rules, and then structures, which was fun for me because honestly, I haven't done a hex crawl in probably more years than I'd like to admit. So, uh, the way that I think this book will add on to the Game Master's Guide and be different from the Kobold Guide to Dungeons, for example, is that Kobold Guide to Dungeons is great, but it's much more of a an overview, sort of a like the theory of it, and it's because it's essays, and it's meant to be read and for you to think about it. This is much more mechanical. You know, there's a lot more rolling on tables, and especially with hex crawls. And let's face it, if you don't know what, so actually, first of all, if you don't know what a hex crawl is, because it is sort of old school, um, hex crawls are basically exploration in a role playing game. So instead of the destination being the goal, it's just flat out exploring untapped wildernesses or underground areas, and it's almost was procedural generated before there was procedurally generated things. Um, and it, probably to give to be transparent, hex crawls are not my favorite things in the world. I mean, there's a lot of minutia with a hex crawl. It's like you're tracking resources and you're tracking how much food you have. Do you have water? Like who lit the fire? And at a certain point, I'm kind of like, oh god, let's just go. But there is something really cool about just exploring. Um, you know, and hex crawls do that in such a great way because usually when you're playing in a D&D game and you're like, okay, we have to go to the to the dragon's den. I'm like, oh, it's in the mountains over there. Great, let's just go. Although there's a road, and off you go, or you just tramp through the wilderness. There's no sense of like, well, what's over that hill, or hey, let's go follow where this river goes. And that's a whole different level of gameplay, and it can be a lot much more immersive than just sort of a goal oriented. Let's just go kill that dragon.
I had kind of the opposite experience, other than the monsters, which are very mechanics oriented. I did combat options, a lot of combat options in the Game Master Guide, and my one of my major assignments for Dungeons and Ruins was combat in the depths. Basically, a kind of a discussion of all the various things that need to be, as a GM to consider when you are creating your dungeon and running your PCs through that dungeon. So I talk about the ecology of a dungeon, and then I talk about uh, different uh, kind of environmental concerns that you have in a dungeon that maybe are different than above ground adventuring. So dark places, uh, small spaces. So you got your oozes that are going through, those 2-foot holes, and you might have to go in there and get stuck in there and get beat up while you're trying to maneuver through this tiny passageway. And Yeah, and then a discussion about kind of overall discussion on some threat levels for your dungeon and how to communicate those. So if you're going to have a very difficult uh, dungeon that's going to be deadly, you might want to communicate that to the players beforehand in some ways, so that they know they can run away from something that's going to kill them. And I know a lot of players don't like to do that. Uh, and then, yeah, the final part was another kind of a mechanical bit, was some dungeoneering type equipment and dungeoneering vehicles that you can use to travel through the dungeons and things like that.
Jeff says the traps get broken into 2 types. You've got your typical instant trap, like a pit. The trap triggers, then you make a save and work out the result. Then there are complex traps where things go by initiative order. Your party gets trapped in a room and suddenly the walls start moving in. You roll initiative and round by round work out how to escape before you're crushed.
Oh, as a side note, for those people listening who are running games, you know, we run a lot of dungeons in D&D, but it occurred to me the other day that without people like doing upkeep and manage and keeping the place going, you might run into a lot of like defective traps. So you could have a room that the walls are closing in, but it stops about 4 feet from each other. You'd use them just to freak out your players. Like they could fail all the rolls, but it's not going to kill them. It's just to freak them out, because broken traps. Why not?
Jeff says, curses depend on circumstances. Sometimes the places are cursed and you suffer the effects while in the area. Other times the place curses you and you have to suffer the effects until you take proper means to remove the curse.
I have a question. Hey, I have a question for Jeff. That's helpful. Hey, so Jeff, when you're dealing with traps and curses, did you delve into haunts? Because haunts can often can function a bit like a curse and like a trap, depending on how they're formulated.
Jeff says, I do have one hazard called Restless Spirits, which functions similarly to the haunt mechanics from that other game.
Well, yeah, like when you think about it, what's a haunt is really sort of weird combination of a trap and a curse that's created by supernatural means. I mean,
I've got another question here for you all. Are there any older dungeons, modules, or adventures that inspired what you wrote for this book?
Good question. Honestly, I looked at the old like the first bunch of D&D adventures, like Keep on the Borderlands and uh, Exploration of the Demon Web Pits and Wilder Lands, all that old kind of the old first edition stuff, because that's really when, for hex crawls, that's when that was like the heyday of hex crawls. That's and then I look, honestly, I did trying to recall my playing of Pathfinder's Kingmaker series, because they did a hex crawl, though their mechanic, I liked it much better in the video game than I did in the book. But luckily, at least for me, Kobold Press is putting out a book of hex crawls, so which was an interesting experiment to make sure that my stuff worked with that stuff. Because otherwise, you never want to put out 2 books that conflict with each other.
Jeff says here, Tomb of Horrors, which makes a lot of sense.
In terms of kind of a dungeon and its ecology, you know, I kind of went back to some of the old classics. Keep on the Borderlands, where you had discrete kind of sections where you meet certain monsters and things like that. And the GDQ series was also a good inspiration. So you had your giants all kind of separated out, and they did their thing, and yeah, and then you went to the underworld with the Drow, and got to see how their kind of politics all work together and how things fit together in that underground society and how to navigate that.
Yeah. I have another question for you all. Of all of the stuff that is in the book that you worked on, what are you most excited to see players and GMs get their hands on or be able to engage with?
I
Well,
guess
yeah, go ahead,
well,
Mike.
it was one of the monsters that I got to design. That um, I just kind of described myself a little bit as a construct with the ruthless efficiency of a Dalek and the neuroses of C3PO.
For me, I think it was I have a bunch of tables that I put in about random hex location encounters with linked story hooks. Um, you know, basically, so if you could, so the GM could place them on the map where they want, or it could be something that's rolled randomly. But there's a connected pair that I liked a lot. Well, there's one that is a mimic, so I did sort of get a mimic in there a little bit. But the mimic one's actually kind of funny. It's a wooden chest on the ground that's obviously a mimic, as it keeps muttering things like, "Nope, not a mimic. Yep, just an ordinary chest here." Um, and it's basically someone who's been shape changed into a mimic, and there's a nearby hag that the players have to go deal with in order to like get him to be restored to his previous shape. And there's also a strange old woman in a chicken hut. So I mean, there's a lot of fun stuff.
Yes, the Baba Yaga.
Yeah, gotta always have to give grandmother her due.
Jeff says, I'm always glad to hear about stories from games where my work is used and really gets the player sweating. I'm looking forward to certain things from this chapter, specifically the Hall of 1,000 Spears and the Curse of the Unseen and the Flash Flood Hazard. And if I can personally say, the Hall of 1,000 Spears sounds particularly terrifying.
Well, it's one more than the Hall of 999 Spears.
So true.
It's one better.
I mean, 999 spears I could do. 1,000?
Yeah,
No.
one more. I mean,
And we have another question here. Why no mimics?
Write your letter to your nearest editor and tell them have Brian make more mimics. Somewhere Thomas is like, what did he just say? I mean, okay, so in all honesty, here's the problem in terms of dungeon design and mimics specifically. After the first one, your players just hack up every piece of furniture they see, and it's not exactly very exciting. So, it's someone mentioned earlier in the thread about being innovative with dungeon design, and I think this book will help people do that, because I mean, after a while you could get in a rut with dungeons, and it's just yet another underground corridor and yet another trap and another door, and the creative thing is supching it up and making it feel new again. In case for people who don't know, that there's a classic supposed to be the world's smallest dungeon, and it's like one room, and someone wrote it out like full description, and it's person, you go into the room, and here it's a 5-foot room, and inside is an orc carrying a pie, and then quest hooks for further adventures. Perhaps the orcs have some sort of bakery, and I mean, it's just really just the treasure is the pie, and the foe is the orc.
Okay, I've got another question here. What elements do you believe are essential for creating an immersive dungeon or ruin in, your tabletop game?
Ooh, that's hard. I think for me, I mean, I think it probably varies for the GM. For me, I think it's a question of some sort of connective tissue, like a story or a legend or something that's connecting all these random rooms. And because it has to sort of make sense. Like, why did someone go through the time and effort to build this place? if you go into a room and there's 1,000 uh griffins, you're going, wait, who's feeding these things? Like, where do they're just stuck in this, like, it doesn't like some early D&D design was like, how did these things get here? Why? Like, can't even leave the room. What's it eating? So it has to me, it has to logically make sense. And it's preferable if there's like a sense of story that you learn as you go. And so there's this lore component. But I tend to do very story-based gameplay, so maybe that's not a surprise.
I talk about a little bit about that in the ecology section. Basically making sure that it makes sense that you're being able to feed and keep all these monsters together without them getting into fights amongst themselves. If you got rust monsters in one room and an iron golem in another, why haven't the rust monsters devoured the iron golem? So
Jeff says, I have to agree with Brian. Suspension of disbelief only carries you so far. You need some sort of thematic nature.
Yeah.
And that makes sense.
It'll take them right out of the dungeon or the game if they're wondering how on earth these things could exist together.
But I mean, need's a tricky word, because do you need it? No, you could have a perfectly great time just throwing monsters and traps at your players if that's the kind of game your players want to do. I think it's better with that kind of stuff. But you could certainly have a murder hobo trap and monster slog and have a perfectly wonderful time rolling dice with your friends. So,
okay, all right, next question is actually one that I can answer. What do we have in terms of maps in the map set? Well, there are 12 maps in the map set, and I can't name all of them, obviously, not right now, but I can name some of them, and I know exactly how to determine which ones to ask, and that's by rolling a dice. So I'm going to get a D4 here, and ooh, okay, 3 of them. So okay. Okay. So we have Caverns of the Bat Cult, Dead Dwarven Halls, which I think might be my favorite, and the Fey Barrow Tomb. All of those sound pretty cool, if I'm being honest. Jeff says, Bat Cult sounds vaguely familiar.
Right, because Jeff has worked on demonic cults.
That makes sense.
So, Kendo, is the hall full of dead dwarves, or is the hall itself dead?
You know what? I don't know. It could be either. Honestly, yeah, it could be like a big dead like creature turned into a hall.
Some weird like undead flesh halls. Maybe it was a towering leviathan that's died and now you've reanimated it and carved a dungeon out of its corpse.
Ooh, yeah, I like that. So new question. How do you approach integrating puzzles and traps into your dungeon designs to keep players engaged and challenged?
Ooh, good question. I think that, for me, it goes back to the story thing again. Like, if you have a certain theme or story that you're implementing in your dungeon or exploration like location, because it could be in the wilderness, for example, or a castle or something. The puzzle for me usually ties in with whatever the theme is, but puzzles can be hard because when you think about it, puzzles aren't challenging the characters; they're challenging the players. Because I haven't seen a player yet who looks at gets a puzzle and then tries to limit themselves or increase themselves to what their characters would be doing, because that's almost impossible. So you have to do a funny tight walk between something that is doable by your players yet isn't so like immersion breaking that it kind of yanks them out of the moment. That's why I don't do math. puzzles because I don't understand them. The players could say almost anything, and I'd go, "Yes, that's exactly right."
I kind of a similar approach with puzzles, but I'll allow the players to kind of punt and make some number of rolls or whatever to have their characters figure out the puzzle or get clues to solve the puzzle.
Oh, good point by Jeff there.
Oh, Jeff said the same thing I said. Okay, cool. Hi, Jeff.
Jeff says you should also have an out for those players that don't want to do puzzles and give them a skill check or something to be able to get past. And then never mind, Mike said it.
This is I feel the same way, and this is sort of like three, experienced game masters who have had many times of their players just staring at them with hatred in their eyes, going, "We don't know how these damn gems go together, and the thing you've given us makes no sense."
But at the same time, I like having puzzles and traps mixed in to my dungeon crawls to just kind of make it something other than combat encounter after combat encounter.
You can also get a lot of mileage out of things that just seem like traps or seem like puzzles. I honestly, and I hesitate to admit this, I stymied my players for about an hour of real game time or of play time with a door that was just stuck because none of them pushed it. And at a certain point, I kind of started, I was going to give them a roll and have them make a check. And finally I said, no, I really want to see how long it's going to take them to figure it out. And they still give me crap about it to this day. And it was just a stuffed door.
That's so funny. Next, what advice would you give to aspiring writers or designers looking to create their own iconic dungeons?
Well, I think the first thing is that if you're looking to create a dungeon that is, that really is iconic, I mean, you're going to have to really come up with a hook and a not a, I don't want to use the word gimmick, but like you have to do something that no one's done before. Like, Tomb of Horrors wasn't really that different than other dungeons because it's just another bunch of hallways underground. The thing that makes it iconic was it was just so deadly. So I think that having an incredible premise is really the thing that hooks you, that has to hook first.
It's you have to have a hook, like Brian said. It's an incredibly fine line because you want something that will translate well enough that a lot of people will get something out of it, that it is something universally talked about. Like Tomb of Horrors, again, it is something that is unique and has kind of a shared experience. And boy, I don't know if it's as easy to do these days.
I don't know, Mike. I mean, I think you. Oh yeah, that was Jeff said it first.
Jeff says, I wouldn't aim for iconic. I'd aim for memorable and fun. If you hit iconic, then you've done it as well as you can.
Yeah, I think that's why Tomb of Horrors just lingers in our memories, because it's so fun to go through it, because you're really just thinking, okay, I should have brought 12 more characters.
Right, and you can share war stories with other people that have played Tomb of Horrors.
I mean, I doubt they sat out, like when they wrote it, I don't think they said, well, this is going to be iconic. They probably went, oh God, those poor players. Or they were thinking, I really hate these guys. And so this is what I'm doing. But a question that ties into this is on the chat is, how do you pare down a dungeon when you figure out that the module gives you is too unwieldy for your group? The poster child for this question is Expedition to Barrier Peaks. Like the original one. It's fun. It's just there's so many empty rooms. It goes on forever. And I think that here the answer to the question is actually kind of easy. You just have to remember that the players don't have the map. So you can you could just look at your map and draw a line from one doorway to a doorway all the way across on the other side of the map and skip everything in between because the players don't know. And if you're going, wow, they're really getting bored with this, skip to the end. There's an old screenwriting adage that says, get into a scene early, late and get out early. So if you start to sense that your players are not enjoying or just done with sort of what you're doing, get out.
Jeff says, Tome of Heroes does push into the realm of adversarial GMing. I think there you have to just prepare your players and let them know, hey, this one isn't going to be a cakewalk. Prepare yourself for the worst.
Well, it was a different time. I mean, like that was written in a time where it was the GM against the players, which really seems unfair.
Yes.
I mean, GMs will win every time. Let's face it.
It's like having an omnipotent, omnipresent God who's also malicious.
Drop an anvil. I mean, okay, that guy's dead.
Rocks fall, everyone dies.
Exactly.
Jeff, I keep stealing stuff from you. I'm sorry.
Well, we've all three of us have been doing this a long time with help with each other for a long time.
Yeah.
So I got out of a dungeon once by having it turn out it was all on the holodeck of a starship, and then transitioned to a Star Trek game for a while.
That sounds amazing. Oh, we have a question here. Speaking of these clues, what are the clues to the more complex puzzles that you can give your players?
Well, now Mike and I are going to wait to see what Jeff writes because he keeps scoping us on it. So now we're just going to wait to see what he says.
Jeff says the traps, of course, have perception and investigation checks to be made to notice and or avoid.
I like occasionally giving the idea that other people have explored these areas beforehand and failed, but they made notes as they went along. So the PCs can find, a pack next to a bunch of bones and see some diagrams that have been doodled to give kind of a foreshadowing of something coming up.
And speaking of foreshadowing, Jeff says the curse section notes that foreshadowing by the GM is helpful. You can also do things like history checks, lore, etc. to forewarn PCs of something nasty ahead.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I also see what the person who asked the question is thinking about too. That I mean, you can set up things like if you know that down the way there's going to be a puzzle door, you can drop hints about the puzzle so that when they get to it, they somehow have the ammunition they need to figure out the puzzle. The hard part is that players, it's like the old rule of three. If you're going to do something like that, make sure you drop whatever that hint is at least 3 times because players will miss it. They'll miss it because you're giving them a big block of expositional text, or they were drinking a soda at the time. You never know why people. It's because it's people. People just miss things. So if you're going to give a hint in advance of something, drop that hint a couple times because someone's gonna miss it.
Jeff says hazards can be sussed out similarly by allowing the appropriate skill or ability checks. For example, the druid notes this sort of fungi is dangerous.
The one thing I will note about that sort of thing, I mean, Jeff's absolutely right. The trick sometimes is that just like running an investigation game, your players may not be trained investigators, and sometimes they don't ask the questions. And I as a GM I try to avoid doing an underhand, like a teeing it up for the players to say like, well, roll this, and give them the hint unless it's something they absolutely need and they just haven't done it. But yeah, I mean, like Mike said, finding notes from a previous adventure can be a lot of fun. You could also lead them into great, dead ends that way too. Like, surely the treasure's this way. No, that's the dragon.
The next question, are there any particular historical or mythological references that influence what you wrote?
Ooh. I always sort of default to history because I was a history nerd. So, I did I did do several deep delves into like well, how long does it take to ride a horse across a country? And, exactly what is this land speed thing? How does that really work? And then realize that this is a game and no one wants to do that level of minutia. So, yeah, I think it's hard because, as much as we love it, I was going to say, get out of my head, Jeff. As much as I love Indiana Jones, like, I don't know that how many places really had working traps. My daughter's is in school for archaeology, and I did ask her professor, when do they learn to avoid rolling boulders? And she said that was second semester. But, I don't know that they actually find that many, active working traps. But, there's a lot of, tombs in history that you can just looking at the picture, I got ideas to put into the hex crawl stuff. Pyramids rising out of the jungle, or towers clinging to the side of a mountain. Stepwell pyramids in India, for example. There's a lot of fodder there.
Yeah, not much beyond what Brian and Jeff said.
Jeff says, does Raiders of the Lost Ark
Absolutely.
count as historical?
I admit I had to do an equipment section, and some of it dealt with mining. So I did delve into older mining practices to see what people did without technology to build these fairly extensive mine shafts.
Ooh, all right. Oh, Jeff says, speaking of mining, I did add a bad air hazard.
I have things to counter that.
Jeff, they're gonna have to make sure that your section and my section goes fits together, because I put in some hazardous gas features and various things in the various exploration parts. So hopefully someone looks at the two of those together and goes, "Oh, these are, connected in some fashion." Yeah, we're looking at you, Megan.
I do love this little mini war that our writers have of oh well, I've made mechanics about bad air. Oh well, I made equipment that allows me to counter bad air. I love this is unintentional little design war we have going on in the book.
Yeah, it kind of feels like doing make pretend on the playground with kids. It's like, oh well, I have the power to create bad air that'll choke you. Oh yeah, well I have the power that lets me be immune.
Yeah, the difference is though, it'll take us about half an hour, because we're going okay, what kind of dice do you need to roll for that? Well, okay, let's do a 20-minute Google search on archaic ways to avoid bad air.
Okay, so we've got another question. Do you have advice for challenging and engaging dungeons for players of different playstyles, like those who may not necessarily like dungeon crawls?
Well, that's the trick, isn't it? I think general order one of gaming really needs to be make sure you're on the same page as your players.
Yep.
And I think we've all probably been in games where, you thought it was going to be this cool role-playing moment, and it turns out to be a giant battle scenario. I think it depends on the player. If you have a player that doesn't want to do the, battle rest, repeat thing, then look to what they are interested in and make your dungeon have that. If they're really into role-playing, fill your dungeon full of people that they can meet along the way, from monsters to animated objects to, wandering monsters, or put a story in there that they can follow. Because, tailoring it to your players, that's, part of the gig.
I think Brian really hit the nail on the head there, right? That's something we see in iconic media, like Dark Souls, for example, right? All of the NPCs that you get to interact with. And while that's not necessarily a dungeon, it's that same sort of progression of complexity and puzzle.
Jeff says, I think that's part of the reason for my chapter. It provides challenges that involve a different playstyle beyond just combat. Curses especially can provide side quests to remove the curse, interact with NPCs, etc. And next question, kind of building off of that, do you think that the complexity of puzzles, traps, and encounters should be tied to the progression of the like exploration of the dungeon, or do you think there's more than just going deeper into the dungeon should equal more challenge?
I mean, I think that's a part of that's personal opinion, probably personal preference in a way. But to me, if the dungeon is the kind of classic thing where somebody has built this thing to guard something, then it only sort of is logical that it would start somewhat lethal and just get increasingly more lethal as you go, because the idea is they don't want you to get to the treasure. If it's a lost city sort of a deal, and your dungeon is much more of a exploring this thing that wasn't specifically designed to murder you, then it's different. Then I almost like to think of those as little mini dungeons, because you'll get to a little area and maybe there's a trap or a puzzle guarding a specific thing in that small area, but it's not the whole thing. There's just lots of those scattered around. I think, depending on your players, the worst thing that you can do is tailor it to them in a way. I mean, to me, the world always feels much realer if you can get in over your head. Like if you get to an area and you're like, oh my God, there's 8 Tarasques here. Maybe we should leave.
I mean, everyone should leave at that point.
Yeah, this is the ancient Tarrasque breeding ground. Let's get the heck out of here.
Jeff says here, in the traditional multiple level dungeon, then deeper usually does equal harder. For things like traps, it's up to the GM to determine the purpose. For example, if the owner/builder wants to protect the thing at all costs, then yes, go for lethality. However, they might have wanted something to use as a deterrent or impairment rather than instant death. It depends on your/the NPC's intent. Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. I like the idea of a dungeon that is not necessarily meant to hurt or kill someone, but there are plenty of them that are like tests of skill or like coming of age, like, oh, you have to go here when you reach certain age to beat this like dungeon. There's like trials or something of that nature, and so they aren't necessarily there to kill the person who's going there, but they are there to make sure they have the skills necessary to, get to the next thing or be able to like move on to the next stage of their life or something of that nature.
Well, and it could also be a celestial dungeon. I mean, it could just be like the center of the thing is some portal to the realm of the gods, and it's created. The area is created by lawful good, archons or something. They wouldn't necessarily want to kill everybody, but they would definitely want to make sure you can't get to the portal.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I can see varying difficulties as you go. And I also see dungeons as kind of a living organism, unless it's just this hermetically sealed thing that the builder created. So factions will change and invaders will end up taking over parts of the dungeon. So I just like kind of keeping it a living thing, and that may change the difficulty as you go.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And then like the idea of monsters resetting traps that had already been sprung or fixed before.
Right. Or when the PCs come through and clear out a level, it's not going to stay empty for long. That's valuable real estate there. So
yeah, you just made it safer for them. Safer for them.
Exactly.
All right. Well, I think that's everything that we have so far today. Thank you all so much for being here for this AMA with these amazing designers, Brian, Mike, and Jeff. Thank you all so much for being here, and thank you for watching this.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.